more to prevent people, particularly African Americans, from voting than any other state. The congressional maps drawn by the Republican legislature and defended by Mr. Farr were so bad that even this very conservative Supreme Court struck them down. Farr defended North Carolina's restrictive ID law, which was passed only after the Republican state legislature requested race-specific data on voting practices so that they could tailor it to disenfranchise African Americans. That is despicable, absolutely despicable. And it's despicable after knocking out two African American women nominees to this district, which is 27% African American, that they now nominate somebody who has this kind of track record. Every senator, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, should be disturbed that Mr. Farr has been involved, often directly, in multiple attempts to disenfranchise communities of color. Voting rights are sacred. They're at the root of the mighty oak we call American democracy. And if you begin to eat at those roots, that tree, that tall and mighty tree, could eventually fall. Generations of Americans have given their lives to extend the right to vote, to maintain the right to vote, that we should be a democracy. So this is not a Democratic or Republican issue. Taking away the voting rights of Americans, whatever race, creed, color, or party, or region, is despicable. And the nomination of Farr is despicable itself. As Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum, two champions of voting rights, said in a statement this morning, when it comes to the trifecta of voter disenfranchisement, voter suppression, racial gerrymandering, restricting of voting rights, Thomas Farr is sadly one of the most experienced lawyers in the country. Farr's record of hostility and disregard for fundamental civil rights disqualifies him for a lifetime appointment that will allow him to codify his discriminatory ideology into law. What era are we living in when a man like this is elevated to the bench? So, we're asking our Republican colleagues to reject the nomination. Every single Democrat will vote no. We need 2 Republican votes. At this point, Senator Flake seems to be voting no, so we just need one more. We hope that our Republican colleagues will rise to the occasion, listen to the words of Abrams and Gillum, and realize that a vote for Mr. Farr is a vote to institutionalize an ideology that believes certain American citizens have no right to vote. That is not America. Senator Feinstein.
Thank you very much, Leader. The North Carolina seat that Tom Farr is being nominated to has been vacant now for 12 years. And that's because Republicans refuse to confirm anyone for the entire Obama administration. During his tenure, President Obama nominated 2 highly qualified African-American women to this seat, one who was originally recommended by Senator Byrd. However, Republicans used their blue slips to block these nominees and to hold open the seat for over a decade. Now, President Trump, as you know, has nominated Tom Farr. He's got a long history of opposition to voting rights. In fact, he has been a leader in suppression of African American voters in North Carolina. This began in the 80s and 90s when he was counsel for the Jesse Helms campaign. In 1990, Helms was in a tight race with the mayor of Charlotte. You may remember Harvey Gantt. And the campaign implemented a strategy to suppress and confuse who were African American voters. The Helms campaign and North Carolina GOP implemented a so-called ballot security program. This program included sending more than 120,000 postcards, almost exclusively to African American voters, saying they were required to live in the precinct in which they would vote for at least 30 days prior to the election. and they could be subjected to criminal prosecution if they did not. Specifically, the postcard said that providing false information was a federal crime, punishable by up to 5 years in jail. The information on the postcard was false and clearly designed to decrease turnout. In questions for the record in the committee, I asked Mr. Farr about this program. He replied that he did not provide counsel and was not aware of the postcards until they were sent. Press reports, though, have indicated that Mr. Farr was involved and engaged in the postcard strategy. In fact, former federal prosecutor Gerard Herbert, who worked on voting rights issues at the Justice Department, told reporters that Farr's statements were false. Since then, Mr. Farr has remained active in efforts to depress and dilute African American voting. In 2013, he defended North Carolina's congressional and legislative districts, which were redrawn after the 2010 census to reduce the power of African American voters. And in 2016, he defended North Carolina's restrictive voter ID law in federal court. Farr strongly denied that racial animus toward African Americans was the motivation for the gerrymandering and voter ID law. However, in both cases, the court disagreed. In fact, in striking down the voter ID law, the Fourth Circuit said that the law's requirements, and I quote, target African Americans with almost surgical precision, end quote. So there's good reason the Congressional Black Caucus, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, dozens of other organizations, and all 49 Democrats are opposed to Mr. Farr's nomination. He does not belong on a federal court.
Senator Leahy.
Excuse me.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Leader. You know, I have voted on more nominees, Republican and Democrat, than any member presently in the United States Senate. And I have voted for both Republican and Democratic nominees. I have a hard time remembering anybody in 44 years less qualified to be on the federal court than Thomas Farr. He's one of the most controversial nominees I've encountered in those decades. What he has done systematically in what has to be a complete bias, trying to dismantle the franchise for thousands of minority voters. He appears to have had a role in this brazen voter intimidation campaign that's already been described, saying they'd be prosecuted if they attempted to vote, which was a flat-out lie. But that says what this man is like. But he then misled Congress about his role in the suppression scheme. He told us under oath that he didn't know about it before it happened. Now we are told his sworn statements are false. We're told that by the Department of Justice. How can anybody possibly think this person should have a lifetime appointment to the federal court? Both the voting laws, the gerrymandering that he was involved in were struck down as unconstitutional. I think somebody who makes a career out of systematically attacking our constitutional right to vote simply does not belong in the federal court, especially when they lie about it under oath. I want to make sure that all of us have the right to vote. I want to make sure that my grandchildren, whether they're white or black, have a right to vote when they're old enough. I don't want somebody like this, somebody who will lie about it, to be able to determine how they can take away the right that I cherish and all of us who vote cherish. Thank you.
Senator Booker.
We're on the eve of a very difficult moment, I think, in the United States Senate, where we are moving to confirm someone who is deeply offensive to many folks in America, regardless of their political party. We have common values in this country that bound us together. As much as people want to try to accentuate the differences between Republicans and Democrats, we do hold together to certain ideals. One of the most sacrosanct ideals that we hold is this ideal of the right to vote. Now, this wasn't always in our country. People from both parties, from all backgrounds, fought together to extend the right to vote to women in this country, to extend the right to vote to African Americans, from those who stood on the Edmund Pettus Bridge to Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, who died together for that right. And now we're on the eve of confirming someone whose career is stained with efforts to suppress the right to vote. It's something that should offend the consciousness of people who are in all parties, because it's offensive to the very ideals which we stand for: the right to vote, one person, one vote, equal justice under the law. As my colleagues have said very clearly, in 1984, Farr managed the so-called ballot security program for the election campaign of Senator Jesse Helms that targeted and attempted to suppress the votes of black North Carolinians. We know, again, as my colleagues have said, in 1990, Farr participated in a so-called ballot security meeting just days before the Helms campaign infamously sent tens of thousands of postcards targeting black North Carolinians, suggesting that they were not only ineligible to vote, but threatened criminal prosecution if they did. We know that he misled members of the Senate Judiciary Committee about that incident and expressed neither concern nor remorse for the ways in which he actively participated in undermining and suppressing the right to vote. And in 2016, of course, as was mentioned by my colleague, Mr. Farr lost one of his biggest cases defending North Carolina's notorious discriminating voter ID law. This is really a moment that, again, is going to test this body. This, again, is not about right or left. It's about right or wrong. There are so many judges that could serve in this position, conservative judges, judges with track records of upholding ideals consistent with the president's jurisprudence. Why this person? Why in a state in the Eastern District that is diverse, in a state with a sad history, like so many of our states, of voter suppression in the past, in a state where African Americans and others will come before him and begin to question the authenticity and the integrity of the judge and therefore the judicial system? We can go another way. We must go another way. Confirming this judge would be undermining the very faith so many Americans must have in our judicial system for it to operate with public trust, to be able to operate in a way that I believe so many fought and struggled to make it so. Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, Senator Harris.
Thank you. The way I see it, this nomination is about two components of our democracy that are frankly at stake. A key component of our democracy is that all people have equal access to the ballot, that their voices be heard, understanding their vote is their voice is their vote. Any impairment, any attempt to disincentivize folks to vote is an attack on our democracy. So that's one point. And we know and we've heard the many examples of where Thomas Farr has attempted to prevent people from having access to the ballot and therefore exercising their right to vote. There's another component of our democracy that's at stake here. We designed a beautiful system of democracy, flawed though it may be. 3 co-independent, equal branches of government, co-equal branches of government, and a free and independent press. And we designed this democracy with the idea that there will be checks and balances whenever there are abuses in our system. There will be checks and balances. And so what do we have on the issue of voting in America today? We have the Supreme Court that gutted the Voting Rights Act with Shelby v. Holder, and which allowed and opened up then states, and there have been many, almost 24, that put in place discriminatory laws that have prevented or sought to prevent people from voting. But then what happened? In the checks and balances, there is supposed to be a system where at the very least, when those states, through those state legislatures, impair individuals' rights to vote, cases can be brought to the courts to litigate the fairness of those laws. And indeed, post-Shelby, that has happened, where cases have gone to court, where there has been found, as you have heard, a court even said, surgical precision, a legislature with surgical precision sought to prevent black voters from access to the polls. So we had checks and balances in our system of democracy. And when they are working, our democracy works. But the problem with the Thomas Farr nomination is this. They're now attempting to put somebody who has demonstrated his ability and willingness to use the power of his position to interfere with people's rights to vote. They want to put him in the position of being in the role of what should be a check on the balance of power on the issue of voting. So what am I talking about? There is currently before the Eastern District a voting rights case. If he is confirmed, he potentially will be ruling on such a case. He who has a demonstrated track record of participating in those very laws that have discriminated against specific segments of our population, and in particular African Americans. So this is an issue that is about, are we going to have a democracy that, one, gives all people access to the polls, but two, that provides checks and balances so that when there are abuses by any branch of government, the other branch can check them. Thomas Farr is not that person, based on his record, who will put a check on any legislature's attempt to discriminate against any specific population in terms of their access to the ballot. And then there is another point with this, which you have heard. This particular seat was held open for 12 years. There were two people appointed, two different people appointed to that seat. One who is a career prosecutor, who is the chief of the appeals division of the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is a division of the United States Department of Justice, and they didn't bring her forward. Separately, another nominee who serves as a justice on the Supreme Court of the state of North Carolina, and they didn't bring her forward. And now they want to bring this person forward. And there should be some recognition among our colleagues of the history of not only voting rights in our country, not only the history of the system of democracy we designed in terms of the need for checks and balances, but also some recognition of the history of this particular seat, both in terms of those who have been nominated before and did not get a fair process, and then putting this fellow on who has a history in this specific state of suppressing votes. We can do better than this. Our colleagues can do better than this. There are many talented people in the state of North Carolina who are well situated and suited to be nominated to this position. Let's do better.
Thank you, Kamala. Questions?
President Trump appears determined to get $5 billion for his border wall in the spending bill. Would Democrats agree to that sum spread out over 2 years?
I believe three things. Number one, we are for strong border security. The bill we originally put together in 2013 had $40 billion, and we are for strong border security. We've made numerous proposals. Number two, the $1.6 billion for border security negotiated by Democrats and Republicans is our position. We believe that is the right way to go. Third, if there's any shutdown, it's on President Trump's back. First, left to our own devices, the Senate and House could come to an agreement. Second, the Republicans are in control of the presidency, the House, and the Senate. A shutdown is on their back. Stick to the $1.6 billion. Yes.
Do you think that the $5 billion request by the president is unreasonable?
They haven't even spent the $1.3 billion. They haven't spent a penny of the $1.3 billion they requested in last year's budget.
Senator, are you shutting the door to anything above $1.6 billion?
This is our position. We're not negotiating in the press. This is our position. Yes.
Senator, among other things that's hanging in the balance is the Farm Bill. It seems to be hung up over wildfires in California and the response to that. Is a deal in the works?
Yes, we're making good progress on the Farm Bill. Senator Stabenow is working very hard with Senator Roberts. The only things left are some forestry provisions, and we're making progress on that. We hope we can get a Farm Bill this year.
I might say, as one of the conferees on the Farm Bill, I think Senator Stabenow and Senator Roberts have carried the best tradition of the Senate They've worked closely together. They've brought up reasonable things. If left to the Senate, it passed easily.
Thank you, everybody.